Hello, this is Marc Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with yet another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marcs, Marc LiVecchhe and Marc Melton, reviewing several pieces from Providence this week. Marc LiVecchhe will share an exchange he had with Providence contributor Dan Strand with some thoughts on just war teaching, a topic of endless fascination. Marc Melton will discuss a post he put up on Providence from Reinhold Niebuhr's Christianity in Crisis magazine 75 years ago, addressing former Vice President Henry Wallace, who was a nearly strident advocate or apologist for Stalin after World War II, which Niebuhr would, of course, critique ultimately. And then finally, I will discuss the death and funeral legacy, especially as it pertains to Iraq, of Colin Powell, former Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But Marc LiVecchhe, we'll start with you. We meaning Providence, hosted our annual Christianity and National Security Conference last week with students from over a dozen colleges and seminaries. Both you and Dan Strand spoke on just war teachings, but you and Dan also had a distinct exchange, if you'd like to share with us.
Do you mean the distinct exchange at the conference or on the podcast?
On the podcast.
Right. Okay. We could talk about the conference as well later. Say again?
Whichever you prefer to share.
The podcast. People can click on it then.
Right.
We'll talk about the other one when it's posted. Dan Strand and I are doing a series, I hope everybody knows, that we're calling True North. This is a play on the idea in military circles of having a moral compass or an azimuth, a way to know where you ought to be heading morally and ethically. And we're doing an overview of the just war tradition, sort of a just war 101. And we've gotten to, at this point, the Prudential Criteria, the jus ad bellum category, jus ad bellum being when is it right to go to war, and it's broken, as I think people hopefully by now know, into two general subcategories of deontological, or the primary things. These are the things that have to be in place before you can go to war. And then there's another set of more prudential side constraints. So things like probability of success, right, last resort, declaration of war, and sort of a proportionality of ends. And in this latest episode, Strand and I discussed proportionality of ends as well as probability of success. Proportionality of ends simply means you have to be able to predict or you have to have a good case for believing that the good you will achieve from the successful completion of your war will override the negative consequences or the harms that will be done by the successful completion of the war, as well as to consider the reverse. If you do not pursue the successful conclusion of what would be a rightly justified war, what will be the goods that would come of that compared to the harms that would come of that. This idea of aiming at a successful completion of a war then ties into the second category of probability of success. You shouldn't start a war, generally speaking, if really there's no possible chance of you achieving the successful war aims. Otherwise, you're probably just killing people and breaking things, ultimately for no good reason. There are exceptions to that, but as a general rule, that would be the policy. And that kind of ties into what you'll talk about later with the Powell doctrine. But these are just some of the prudential side constraints that help us to think wisely about when it's right to fight.
Well, as you say, speaking of Powell and of war, he was statesman and soldier, a Vietnam War veteran who rose to become obviously a general, Ronald Reagan's national security advisor in the 1980s, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under the first President Bush during the Persian Gulf War, and later Secretary of State during the George W. Bush administration at the time of 9/11 and the launch of the Afghan and Iraq wars. My column in Providence notes that he was a lifelong Episcopalian, son of Jamaican immigrants, and though the son of Caribbean immigrants, had the beliefs and convictions and stature of the old WASP establishment, and seemed to embody the sort of Episcopal Anglican understanding of an appreciation for power and national responsibility. He certainly was, although he probably never used the term, was a Christian realist, practical, pragmatic. Let's do the most good that is possible, but not be soaring or idealistic in our goals. He is, of course, of late most remembered for his legacy with the Iraq War, having embraced the narrative of weapons of mass destruction, which he later lamented. And yet with the collapse of Afghanistan, I suggest the argument could be made, maybe ultimately it will be made, that while Afghanistan was supposedly the good war, the regime we helped construct there has collapsed, while Iraq was, quote unquote, the bad war, the war of choice. And yet the regime there seems to endure and just concluded relatively successful free and fair elections. So that will be the irony if Iraq succeeds and Afghanistan fails, but we may not know for another 50 or 100 years. Hence, we should be modest in our sweeping judgment. So those are my proposals. Marc LiVecchhe, you're also doing your own piece on Colin Powell.
Yeah, I'm just focusing. I think it'll dovetail nicely with your own piece. There's been a lot of conversation about the Powell doctrine, what it is, what it isn't, all of that. I'm just going to focus on one element of it, and that's this idea of overwhelming or decisive force that he talks about. He believes that war should be avoided if at all costs, which is a very Christian realist, very just war perspective. But if war must be, then that war ought to be fought with decisive enough force so as to achieve the military objectives. Otherwise, as in arguably Afghanistan and Iraq, if you're not going to commit the resources necessary, maybe you ought not to do the thing in the first place. As he says in his memoir, the only reason we needed the surges in Afghanistan and Iraq is we didn't put in the proper number of troops to begin with, and that was a mistake. That was an error, and it was a significant one. And then I touch on the distinction he makes. It's very often cast as his commitment to the overwhelming use of force, and in his memoir he asks to be more precise by saying decisive is his preferred term, not so much overwhelming, and that's just to highlight that overwhelming force might in fact be too much force, that the focus instead should be simply the decisive achievement of the end. And so I play with what the nuances there a bit, which I think is more than semantics. It is important. And then just as an aside to both our essays, today, as you know, was his funeral service at the National Cathedral. And I commend some of the video if people haven't watched it, particularly the video, the eulogy by his son, Michael Powell. I found it deeply moving, and as a father, I could only aspire that my own son would think me worthy of such esteem, which I think says much about the general himself.
Thank you, Marc LiVecchhe. Mark Melton, as mentioned, you posted a piece from Reinhold Niebuhr's magazine responding to the Stalin-friendly stance of the former Vice President Henry Wallace in 1946 that ultimately led up to his independent run for the presidency in 1948. So tell us a little bit about that and its relevance for today.
Right. So this speech given in September 1946, it was given at a Beat Dewey rally. Dewey was running, I believe, for re-election of governor of New York. And so in the speech, it is originally reported that it was approved by the Truman administration, but it criticizes the Truman administration's foreign policy, specifically its quote unquote, get tough on Russia policy. And according to Wallace, he says that getting tough never brought anything real and lasting, whether for schoolyard bullies or businessmen or world powers, which I think we might question that line a bit here. But he also goes through several other points that were actually not uncommon amongst the American left at the time, that basically the United States needed to cooperate with the Soviet Union, very skeptical of being allies or working with the British. In fact, this viewpoint looks at the British Empire as the next great rival for America, and that a lot of people in America they felt a kinship to the Soviet Union, especially on the left. And so Reinhold Niebuhr responds to this in, I believe it's the next month, so October 1946. He writes a piece that blasts Wallace a good bit. He's emphasizing the need for both a firm and patient foreign policy. And we can kind of get into the details of what that actually means. I don't think it means what post-Cold War, what we think it would mean as far as a patient foreign policy. But I have another piece that will address that question next week. And I found overall the piece from Niebuhr jarring. Like, if you look at it by itself, it looks like he's being very critical of Wallace, which he is. But I found that reading through 1945, 1946 articles from Christianity in Crisis, they say a lot of the same things that Wallace was saying, being critical of U.S. relations with the United Kingdom from Niebuhr, the idea of meeting the Soviet Union halfway, being very patient and wanting cooperation with them. They were arguing, honestly, I think a lot of the same things that Wallace was, but Wallace was sticking to his guns when the Truman administration was moving closer to an anti-communist stance and more openly doing that with the public. You have so as I see it, like you're seeing a split between Wallace and Niebuhr and Christianity in Crisis, even though I think Christianity in Crisis contributors are still not recognizing the threat of the Soviet Union quite yet. They don't really do that until I think after the Czechoslovak coup, and they do support the Marshall Plan in 47 as it's being presented. I don't think it actually passes until 48, but they are promoting it, whereas Wallace kind of criticizes it. So there's a divergence that's kind of starting to happen here. And one of the interesting points here is that in early 1947, the journal, because of inflation and other stuff, they're having to do a fundraiser drive to keep the journal going. And so they asked the readers, like, should the journal keep going? And they get enough money. I think they need like $5,000. So they get enough money to cover the cost. But they also got like about 100 or so people respond, being like, no, we don't think the journal should respond. The reason why is because you're attacking Wallace. So Wallace was actually very popular with the American left. And Niebuhr expected that Wallace was going to split the Democratic Party apart. And he was worried about reactionary forces, aka the Republicans, gaining power, and that he was worried about this very pro-capitalist, very anti-communist force in America. He was worried that it was going to take over. And interestingly, on the eve of the 48 election, he's basically, like everyone else in America, says Dewey's going to win. This is a boring election because we know it's how it's going to turn out. He criticizes the Truman administration. He says Truman doesn't understand foreign policy. And so you see this these interesting dynamics, and I kind of go through some of those. And so, of course, you can read it, or watchers, listeners can go and read it. But it's an interesting split because I still think that there's not anti-communist enough. I think they were still too reluctant, and so yeah.
Lessons that sometimes even Christians or Christian realists are not entirely realistic and succumb to their hopes and former idealisms. But Niebuhr did eventually come to his better senses. And of course, even Henry Wallace, as you note, eventually repudiated his stances of the 1940s and became very anti-communist late in life anyway.
And voted for the Republican apparently in the 50s.
Marc, LiVecchhe, any more thoughts from you?
I'm pretty good. I'm excited to see the national security videos get posted. It was a great conference this year. Anybody who's missed it should be lamenting that and should sign up for next year.
Well, if they're a college student or a professor, certainly let us know if you'd like to join us next year. But we're delighted to post the videos of Eric Patterson's presentation on Christian realism and also remarks from Megan Reese, who is National Security Advisor to Senator Mitt Romney, but 15 or 16 videos to go, so much to look forward to. Thank you, gentlemen, for another episode of Marksism. Until next week, bye-bye.